One of my really good friends worked as an STNA at a hospital while going to school to be an engineer, and he always had some pretty horrific stories. He finally resigned after obtaining his degree in a position as an engineer. Over the past few years, though, he shared a lot of these horror stories with me. Usually, these stories were more disgusting than they were scary because the STNA is basically a janitor for nurses and doctors. They, for the most part, don't actually treat patients or anything. But this last story he told I could tell chilled him to the bone. Apparently, during the last week he was there, my friend, who I'll call Evan, was walking the floors of the hospital. It was his last shift in the psych unit. He was almost done cleaning up after a man who received a transfer to a more high-functioning area. He was cleaning the man's bed and removing the used biohazard bags when he heard a noise behind him. He hadn't checked, but the room was a double, which means the man that left, he had a roommate. Evan turned around and looked at the guy. He never interacted with patients and didn't really know what to do. He says they stood there for several seconds without anything happening besides the patient's heavy breathing. Then, without warning, the man approached Evan quickly and grabbed him by his shirt collar. Now, Evan is a pretty average-sized guy, but wasn't one who went to the gym. And he said this guy was huge, like a David and Goliath type ordeal. The guy lifted Evan up so only the tips of his toes were barely scraping the floor. He stared into Evan's eyes before leaning in to whisper in his ear. He told him that he had 5 seconds to get out of there or he'd break his legs. The man then continued to stare Evan in the eye with an insane hatred that Evan described as soul-piercing. Then he dropped him. He placed his hands over his head and began to scream, almost like a wailing sound, in pain. Evan grabbed the cleaning supplies and ran out of the room. The man was threatening to kill him as Evan escaped. Now, this is what's weird. Evan happened to report the incident to the nurses on the psych unit floor. But apparently, that man had only just been admitted from the emergency room. He came in before Evan's shift had even started with a severe head injury. He was screaming in the ER, and when the nurses tried to help him, he picked one of the male nurses up and tossed him over the side of the nurses' counter. A group of doctors and nurses attempted to restrain him, but he powered through them, still yelling, until security got there. When Evan found this out, he didn't return for his remaining shifts. He only just filled me in on this story too about 6 months ago. And whenever I mention it, he doesn't want to talk about it. And I, for one, don't really blame him. During my first year of nursing, I had an elderly patient, who I'll call Beatrice, come in who had gone into cardiac arrest. By the time the EMTs wheeled her into the ER, she was already flatlined. I, at the instruction of the attendant, commenced CPR and chest compressions. This went on for 30 minutes. We brought the woman back several times, but just couldn't seem to keep her alive. And eventually, time of death was called. The doctor asked that I go with him to inform her husband of her death, while the other nurses cleaned up. It was my first time informing a person of a loved one passing, and it was pretty hard. Her husband cried, and I stood there, awkwardly, not knowing how to comfort the guy. A few hours later, after the situation had died down a bit, I was sitting at the nurse's station filling out patient paperwork and clocking the duties I completed that day before assisting in a surgery. And that's when a strange man in jeans and a brown leather jacket approached me. Now, the nurse's station in my hospital is different than most, as it doubles as the front counter for the ER. We're a very small hospital and didn't have another area for the secretaries, so oftentimes us nurses just did their jobs for them. The man who approached me was clearly old, but in excellent shape. Other than his silver hair and wrinkles on his face, the guy looked immaculate. He asked if a woman named Beatrice was admitted. I asked him who he was, and he claimed he was her husband. Confused, I told him her husband had already been here. I then asked for his ID, and it was confirmed. He and the woman not only shared the same last name, but they also lived in the same house according to their IDs. I told him that she had passed on. Now, at this point, I was slightly freaking out. I already had to deal with one grown man breaking down, and I wasn't sure if I could handle another. But that's not what happened. When I informed him that she had died, all he said to me was, "Thank you." Then he turned to leave. I called after him. Excuse me, thank you? He turned to me and smirked. "Yeah, I just came to make sure the whore was dead." And with that, he left. I still don't know who that first guy was. I'm assuming a lover, but that was definitely one of the weirder things I've ever witnessed. I'm a nurse that works in the emergency wing of the hospital on certain nights. I've seen a lot of weird things come through, and while these gruesome scenarios are a dime a dozen in my profession, the ones that always get me are the ones with a twist. Now, this one happened about 3 years ago. I had just returned from a 2-month maternity leave and had only received a few patients when we had a man wander in. He wasn't very well. His jeans were torn and the bubble vest he was wearing had several holes in it. He looked like he hadn't shaved in days. He came in with his hand on his shoulder. At first glance, there didn't appear to be anything wrong with the guy. Then he turned around. The man had a huge knife embedded in his left shoulder blade, and it was in there pretty deep. The doctor I was working with, who I'll call Dr. Morgan, immediately took the man in and began his work on him. I won't go into all the details, but in the end, the knife came out and the man was stitched up properly. The guy was eager to go, but Dr. Morgan wanted him to stay overnight. Normally, for knife wounds, you can fix someone up and they can leave almost immediately. However, this knife had gone in so deep that we wanted to make sure there was no damage to the movement of his arm and hand. He said that was okay and that he didn't want to trouble us. When Dr. Morgan told him it was no trouble, the man insisted forcibly that he be allowed to leave. I looked at Dr. Morgan and then back at the man. Because he wasn't admitted to the psych ward or anything, we legally couldn't make him stay. Without looking away from the man, Dr. Morgan asked that I go get the form for his medical insurance and discharge papers. You know, the one where he knows he's leaving against medical advice. I nod as Dr. Morgan leaves. As he does, the man hops off the medical bed and makes his way towards me. I look at him for a moment, very uncomfortable. He looks down at me. I'm only 5'3". He's easily a foot taller than I am. And he starts to grin. I asked him if he needed anything, and he said no, but then he started swaying. He was swaying back and forth like the way a toddler does when they're trying to look cute in order to get something from their parent. It was creepy, to say the least. "Okay, I'm gonna go get your forms now. Wait here, would you?" The man smiled and sat down. He told me to take my time. I didn't. I rushed to the nurse's counter where we kept the extra forms for patients who came into the emergency room. I grabbed the 4 insurance forms and the medical advice packet. But when I returned, the man was gone. I asked around at the other private stations, to doctors and nurses who were attending to the other patients, to see if they had seen him, but they all said they hadn't. Now, this actually isn't that unheard of. Due to rising costs of medical treatment, a lot of people skip out on providing their name and insurance information when they come to the ER, since it's the most expensive area of the hospital to visit. The man claimed his name was Dan, but never left his last name. I didn't think too hard about it, though. It's happened several times before in my career, so I just left his name with security to go back through the cameras and find him. Now, fast forward about a week. I'm at home with my infant son, as he had a checkup appointment around noon. My husband had just left for work, and I was bathing my son in the kitchen sink when I turned on the TV. I flipped it to the morning news channel and listened while gently pouring water over my son's head. That's when I heard it. The news anchor had announced that the police were looking for a man that robbed and murdered an elderly woman in her house a couple nights ago. I looked over to watch, drying off my son, and I saw just in time for them to show the sketch. I immediately stopped. The sketch looked just like the man I treated last week. But I continued watching, thinking maybe I had the wrong guy. First, it was a sketch, not an actual picture, and I hadn't actually seen the guy in a week. On top of that, I only interacted with him for a couple of hours. The anchor also stated he was wanted as a suspect in a robbery that had happened the previous week. It was foiled, though, as they stated the house had a silent alarm that had alerted the police. The owner came home and discovered his kitchen window was broken and the house was a mess. Again, coincidence. At least that's what I kept trying to tell myself. That's when the footage from the hospital began to play. They showed him walking into the ER with his arm packed by a dishcloth, me greeting him, Dr. Morgan leaving, and then myself leaving to get the papers. The man casually walking out behind me and darting left. I quickly dressed my son in complete disbelief. When I went to work the next day, I asked Dr. Morgan about it, and he said that the police would be coming in to question both of us that day. And they did. Now, I don't know if they ever caught the guy, but since then the hospital has changed their policy on how they handle the ER. Any patient from now on who enters the ER must give their medical information and proof of an ID before getting treated when the injury is not life-threatening. I know it was years ago, but I still feel bad. If we had this protocol back then, perhaps that woman, perhaps she'd still be alive. Hey guys, it's Elise. I wanted to come on here and say thank you to all of you that have subscribed to my channel and watched my videos. I have 165 subscribers, and trust me, I appreciate every single one of you. So thank you for the support. And if you're new to my channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Until next time.